Now in 2 Samuel chapter 11, this is where it comes up to David's sin with Bathsheba and then his murdering Bathsheba's husband to try and cover up his adultery with her. This is one of the bad spots in David's life. And it not only was a bad thing that happened right then, but it just set up a series of things in his future, and it caused all kinds of sexual immorality among his children, rebellion, murder, all kinds of things. It just allowed the devil to come in, and David suffered greatly through this, as well as did other people. And so this is one of the black times in David's life. And you know, this is one of the things that I appreciate so much about the Word of God, that even though David is one of the major characters, and I mean, Jesus talked about him, you know, there's scriptures in the New Testament that talks about the sure mercies of David and all of these things. And here we are thousands of years later talking about this man who is a man after God's own heart. And even though there were great things written about him and there's many things to emulate in a positive way, the Bible doesn't just sugarcoat this. The Bible doesn't just, you know, gloss over his mistakes. I mean, it points out in vivid detail David's failings. And again, as it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, these things are written so that we might learn through them not to lust, not to have these problems. So the Bible doesn't only put people up and show us all of the positive things to emulate, it shows us every wart, every blemish, every problem in a person's life, and there's things to learn from that. And so this is one of those examples right here where David made one of the worst mistakes of his entire life, and how God dealt with him over it, how he repented of it, how he was able to persevere, and how he was able to come back. You know, even though this is a terrible instance that we're going to be dealing with right here, David did overcome this. And David was able to regain his position with the Lord, and David was able to complete the purpose that God had for him. And see, right here is one of the great lessons that you can learn, that I doubt if anybody watching this program has messed up as badly as David has. It's possible that somebody has committed adultery and murdered the husband of the woman, trying to make it, you know, to cover for his sin, and then the child died, and then his own son committed the same lewd act with the sister, and one of his sons killed the brother, and then that led to a civil war, and over 10,000 people died as a result. All of these things came because of what David did right here. I doubt if there's anybody watching this program that has experienced the same thing, and yet David recovered. And David went on to finish his course and to be a man that God loved. If that could work for David, it can work for you. David was under an inferior covenant. Today, the grace of God is revealed and released through Jesus in a way that it was never released in the old covenant. If David could recover, I can guarantee you, you can recover. There is forgiveness and reconciliation. And I say it this way, that God is at least as good as a GPS system. What I mean by that is all of us have used these GPS systems, and if you make a wrong turn, it doesn't just say, "You idiot, you missed the turn, you'll never get there now." But instead, it'll say something like, recalculating. And it doesn't matter where you turn, which direction you go, that GPS system can plot a way to get you back on course and get you to where you need to go. God is certainly able to do that. It doesn't matter how much you've messed up your life. You could have done as badly as David did right here, and yet God can recalculate. God can get you back on course. David suffered some things. I'm not saying that it was easy. He made things a lot worse on himself than they had to be. Likewise, you may have made some really bad things that are costing you and costing other people. But God can recalculate. God can get you back on track. So even though this is a negative experience in David's life, it teaches us a positive lesson, and that is that God can overcome whatever mess you make of your life. God can do something. So right here in 2 Samuel chapter 11, it says in verse 1, "And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabab, but David tarried still at Jerusalem." Now this is somewhat subtle, and sometimes people miss this, but there's a reason why David fell into this sin. And part of that reason, let me just restate this again, that you know what, sin doesn't come upon you like a seizure. You don't catch it by being, it's not like a cold that you get around somebody else who's got a cold and you catch it and you didn't want it, but it just happens. Sin has to be conceived, is what it says over in James chapter 1, that sin, when it conceives, lust, when it conceives, brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Sin has to be conceived. Hopefully everybody watching this understands that the stork doesn't bring babies. It doesn't come by drinking the water after another person who's pregnant. You have to be impregnated. You have to conceive a child. Likewise, sin is conceived. You may not understand where that sin was conceived, but I guarantee you somewhere you had to do something that opened yourself up to this. Sin doesn't come on you like a seizure, and you don't just catch sin. There are reasons why people sin. You know, there was a man in Colorado Springs who was a pastor of a very large church here, world famous. And anyway, he fell into sexual sin, homosexuality, and doing dope. And he was a friend of mine. He had taught in the Bible school. And when this happened, many of our Bible college students were just devastated. And so I got up and addressed it. And people were saying, how could this happen? Man, if a person who loves God and is serving God and is doing all of the things that this person did, if this can happen to them, well, then there's just none of us that are secure. How can we know that we're going to be serving the Lord? And I got up and used some of these exact scriptures, and I told them, I said, sin has to be conceived. I said, this blindsided me. I didn't see it coming, but I can guarantee you this didn't just happen. This isn't something that just broadsided him. It wasn't a mistake that he made one time and he just couldn't help it and it was just a brief sidestep. I said, I don't know the details, but if you could dig deep enough, you would find out that this is something he opened up the door to. He's been entertaining this. And anyway, I won't go into all of the details, but as the thing drug out, it turned out that this is something that had been going on for 20 years with multiple people. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It went back to things when this guy was a kid, and there were reasons why it happened. Sometimes we don't know it, but I'm telling you, based on Scripture, there are reasons why people fail. There are reasons why people give in to sin, and they fail and do these things. And right here, subtly, is one of the reasons why this whole sin with Bathseba happened, is because it was time for kings to go to battle. They didn't have the modern technology and things that we do. We can wage war just nearly under any conditions today, but back then there was a time when people fought, and it was after the end of the year. The Jewish calendar ended. The first of the year was in what we would call our springtime, and so after the first of the year is when people went out to wage battle. David was the king. David was anointed by God to conquer these territories and help Israel fulfill the purpose that God originally intended back with Moses and Joshua. And the Israelites had never really done it. David expanded the Israelite kingdom to its largest expanse, and this was one of the mandates that God had for him, was to finally conquer these people, such as the Jebusites, the people who lived in Jerusalem, and David conquered them. He extended the kingdom of Israel to the largest extent it ever had throughout history, and this was what David was anointed to do. It was time for him to go out to battle, but now David was so close to accomplishing all of his goals and gaining all of the territory that God had given the nation of Israel, that you know what? He didn't have to do what God had called him and anointed him to do. He was so prosperous. He was so successful. This was a relatively small battle that he just sent his general Joab out to fight his battle. And he stayed in Jerusalem. He wasn't doing what God called him to do. He was now so prosperous that he didn't have to lead the battles anymore. When David was small, when he was first become king, he had to go out and he led the troops and he inspired them. But now he was just so prosperous that this was a minor thing. He didn't have to do what he was anointed to do. And I don't know if you're tracking with me on this, but I'm telling you that this is one of the great dangers that a person has in their life, and that is that you need to have a goal, a purpose for your life. You need to know what God made you for, and you need to have that goal and purpose. You need to be headed towards that goal, and you don't ever, ever, ever need to get to where you do not have vision and you are just coasting, feeling like you've accomplished everything. I'm telling you, God is a huge God. God's plans for us are bigger than any of us. I don't believe any of us ever see the totality of what God wants us to do fulfilled. I mean, you just head towards, like in my life, I've been serving the Lord. I've been in ministry for 46 years. God has done some awesome things with me. He's raised up a lot of things. This Bible college campus that we're building, you know, I've got the first of 2 buildings built. We're working on the second one. It's another 2 or 3 year project. And some people, you know, might just think, well, you've accomplished what God wants you to do after that second building gets finished. But God has already given me things far beyond that. I've got things I hadn't told anybody, because right now my staff is terrified with the things that I'm already doing. But I've got vision way out there. I think that once a person outlives their vision, that's not a healthy situation. I've seen people, my own mother, you know, she retired when she was around 65, I think it was, and my mother was a beautiful woman. I remember I was driving along with one of my friends, and my mother was about 60 years old, and my friend whistled at her. She was at a distance, you know, he couldn't see her real good, but she was a beautiful woman, and my friend whistled at her, and I said, that's my mother. She was a beautiful looking woman. She was healthy and everything. When she retired, she aged more in the next 2 or 3 years than she had in 60-something years. She began to go downhill. And so I offered her to come to work for me. She opened up my mail for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years after all of that. And, you know, when she started working and having a purpose, she loved what she was doing here. She recovered. Her health got better. She looked younger. Everything. I've seen so many people that when they retire and they just start coasting, man, everything goes downhill. I mean, it's a proven fact that if you exercise and continue to do weights and walk and do things, that you're healthier. But when you just become complacent and you don't do anything, it actually makes you lethargic. It actually hinders your body. Your body needs to be moving. Your mind, your heart, everything needs to be focused on something. You need to have a purpose in life. In the Christian realm, I don't believe that retirement is really a good thing. Now, I'm not against people who retire from a job, but I mean, you need to have something that is moving you forward, a reason to get up in the morning and a purpose to your life. If you don't have that, I guarantee you it's detrimental to everything, your health, your emotional health, and all of this stuff. David was in a place where he was pretty close to accomplishing the goals that God had given him. And David wasn't doing what God called him to do, and he was just goofing off. He was coasting. And you can see that in the next verse, because look at verse 2. It says, "And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose up from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look on." Now let me ask you this. If you are just getting up off of your bed as the sun sets, what does that mean? That means you're sleeping during the day. That means you're napping. This is not describing a person who's king and is doing all of the affairs of state. David had led that nation. This is getting towards the end of his life and of his ministry, and he had obtained so much. He had a system set in place, all of the things. And David wasn't being king. He wasn't fighting the battles. He wasn't even staying at home and running the business of the nation and doing all of this. He was sleeping during the day. David was bored. And I'm telling you, when you don't have a vision and when you get bored, that is breeding ground for the devil. You need to have a purpose in life. You know, I know that I'm speaking to some people right now that you really don't have a purpose, that you're just coasting and you're wondering why things are happening. I'm telling you, if you're breathing, God's still got a purpose for your life. If you're still alive, God's got a purpose for you being here. There are people for you to reach. There are ways that you can influence and make a contribution. Maybe you've retired from your job. But man, there are so many businesses and nonprofits and all of these things that could use your services. You need to get involved. There are needs and problems all around you, and if you've still got breath on the inside of you, there is something that you could be doing. You need to go before the Lord and find out what His purpose for your life is. And somebody's thinking, but I'm old. Moses was 80 years old before he started fulfilling the call of God on his life. Did you know we had a woman graduate from our school who was 89 years old when she graduated? And this woman was just like a spark plug. I mean, she just encouraged everybody in the school. She was a blessing to people. She was an inspiration to people. I don't care how old you are. I don't care what your situation is. God's got a purpose for your life. And if you're just sitting there goofing off and doing nothing and watching TV all day long and you don't have a purpose in your life, you are opening yourself up to problems. You need to have something that is bigger than you and something that is driving you. Man, I could spend a lot of time on this, but all of this I get out of 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, that David was bored. David was sleeping during the day. If David was doing what God had called him to do, and if he was out fighting the battle, or at the very least, if he would have been running the affairs of state and dealing with things instead of just delegating it to other people, if he'd have been doing what he was anointed to do, he would have been working during the day, he'd have gone to bed at night, and he wouldn't have even entered into this entire situation. I'm telling you, there are reasons why people fail. There are reasons why all of this stuff happens, and a lot of it has to do with people do not have a vision. It says in Proverbs chapter 29, where there is no vision, the people perish. Where there is no vision, I guarantee you, Satan comes in and all kinds of things begin to happen. You need to have a purpose to your life. David did not have it. And so he was getting up off of his bed. He was just waking up when it was time to go to bed, and he saw Bathseba washing herself. You know, some people might try and criticize Bathsheba and say that this woman should have been more discreet. You know, she enticed David, and they try and make an excuse of this. Later in Psalms chapter 51, after Nathan had rebuked David for his sin, David repented in Psalms chapter 51, and he took full responsibility for his sin. He never blamed Bathsheba. He never said, well, the affairs of state were just such a pressure on him. Michal had rejected him. You know, we taught about that on our program yesterday from 2 Samuel chapter 6. He didn't blame Michal and say, my wife wasn't ministering to me the way I should. See, this is the way that people approach things today. Instead of accepting responsibility for their own actions, they blame anybody and everybody else. And I'm sure that there are some people with that mindset who say, well, Bathsheba shouldn't have been doing this. You know, David was just a man. She got his emotions and his, sex drive going and stuff, and so Bathsheba is at fault. David never said that. And I'm not saying that other people don't entice us. I'm not saying that other people don't hurt you and do things to you that cause problems, but I am saying that nobody can make you sin without your consent and your cooperation. If David would have been doing what he was supposed to do, if he was seeking the Lord and staying strong as he had been in the past, this would not have been a temptation to him. You cannot blame other people for what you're doing. Boy, that is a huge statement right there. You need to quit blaming everybody else and talking about it's society's fault. And you need to accept responsibility for the mess your own life is. David was responsible for this. And in verse 3 it says, and David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her home. Now, I'm not absolving Bathsheba of any responsibility here. You know what? David was the king, and some people might say, well, Bathsheba had no choice. He was the king. He could do whatever he wanted to. Bathsheba could have stood up to him. I mean, at the very some people think this is terrible, but you know what would he have done? If he'd have killed her, it still would have been better to have maintained your integrity and your holiness rather than consent. But David wasn't that kind of a guy. I don't think he would have killed her. It would have convicted him, and he would have realized she was more righteous than him. Anyway, I'm not absolving Bathsheba of responsibility. It looks like she was a willing participant in this, but that's really a separate issue. We're talking about David, and you cannot sit there and say that David was enticed by this woman, that it was somebody else's fault. David bore total responsibility for this error. And here's another lesson that you can learn from David, and this is a bad lesson, that David had surrounded himself with people who were just yes men, and that they would do whatever he said. David did not personally go get Bathsheba. He sent messengers, and they helped him and participated in this adultery. And when David killed Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, he didn't do it himself, but he used Joab, the general, to do it. And he put him in a place where he knew it was dangerous, and then he had all of the other soldiers remove themselves from him and left Uriah, and Uriah got killed. Did you know David had people around him that fostered his sin? And this is a lesson that you can learn from David, a bad lesson, but you do not need to surround yourself with people that are just yes men. You need to have people of integrity around you that you are accountable to. And if you do something wrong, that they'll call your hand on it. Boy, that's a big deal right there. I'm out of time today, but you could make a bigger deal out of that. That's something we need to have, people around us, people of integrity that will hold us accountable and that will encourage us instead of just bow down and say whatever we want to have said and help us to live in sin. The people that you hang out with, the people that you surround yourself with, if you're a leader, the people that you have on staff, it is really important that you surround yourself with the right people.